Joining us today on the podcast, we've got Derek Lee, co-host of the Future Sickos Podcast. Derek, how are you doing today, sir?
Man, I'm doing great. The sun is shining in October. It's like plus 20 outside, so I couldn't be happier. I'll be heading to Ottawa soon to go to the Sens and Rangers game on the weekend. So really looking forward to that. And honestly, couldn't be doing better. How about yourself?
Nice. Yeah, I was going to say a rarity, a nice little bit of a late summer day here in Ottawa. Sun shining here as well too. And speaking of Ottawa, I mean, it's nice for you guys as a hockey podcast to actually have meaningful hockey games to talk about again for a change, rather than just speculating when Brady Cachuck is going to sign or who's getting called up or called down. Like, you guys must be getting back into the swing of things now the season's kicked off.
Man, I got to tell you, it was one of the worst summers for content. I mean, there was just nothing to talk about aside from what's going on with the Brady Cachuck drama and the internet drama around the Brady Cachuck thing now. So it does feel like a weight's been lifted and we can finally just talk about hockey, which we actually are excited to talk about. And then next thing you know, like the capacity thing is becoming another issue. So it always seems like there's something in the background and you just can't ignore the background noise. But I got to tell you, man, I'm super pumped about this young team and I'm super excited to just finally start to dive into some of the actual hockey talk that we finally get to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there always seems to be something going on with Sens Twitter or Sens social media. There's always a show around the show. And obviously a huge one this offseason was the will he, won't he, whose leaked information is correct as far as where the negotiations stand. But when all is said and done, Sens are off to a hot start. They're going to get a little shot in the arm when Brady does actually return to the lineup in a couple of days. 7 years, $57.5 million contract. Just what was your initial takeaway when they finally announced that he had put pen to paper in terms of, length, dollar value, the weight off the shoulders, how the Sens can move forward? Like, what was that day like when you finally heard the news?
Well, it was one of the most memorable days at least in recent memory as a Sens fan. And I think it was such a pivotal contract for the team. I mean, if you look at the term and the dollar value alone, and then you compare that to Brady Cachuck's production, you're probably not going to be super pleased with how much that contract pays him right now. But if you account for inflation, you look at a few different things, and the fact that the player was more comfortable on a bridge contract, which was, one of the leaks, whether we know if that's true or not, who knows, right? It's anybody's guess. But the fact that they were able to lock him up that late, like coming right up against the regular season, literally the day of the regular season for the Ottawa Senators, the fact they were able to get him for 7 years, I was elated, man. I was over the moon excited. I didn't think it was possible.
No. Well, I was going to say, if you look at it from just a sheer numbers stance, right? Like, it's probably a bit of an overpay to get that 8.2 average annual value there when you compare it to maybe, say, a Pedersen or Svechnikov that a lot of people are kind of using as benchmarks. But based on how this organization has handled some of its homegrown talent and fan favorites over the years, it's got to be like a pill that you can at least swallow to lock him up for the term that you got, right?
Absolutely. The team was already sort of dealing with a leverage issue when it came to this contract. And I think Brady's camp took advantage of that. They were well aware about that. And the player is entitled to get as much money as the player can get. And we also have to consider the fact that Ottawa wasn't willing to pay him any signing bonuses. Other teams are able to sort of front load that contract and pay some of that money up front. We didn't see that here at all. There's no signing bonus. There is a no movement clause that kicks in later on. But for Brady Cachuck, I think, he's happy because he gets to play with some of his best friends that are on the team, but also because it kind of shows from the organization that they're willing to spend money on the core group, whoever they identify as this core group moving forward. And for us fans, I mean, that's the biggest deal here. The team is showing a willingness to at least spend on this core group. And I believe in this core group. So I think there's a lot to be excited about going forward. And it starts with this Brady Cachuck contract.
Do you think he gets named captain his first game back?
I don't think so. I don't think it's going to happen the first game back. I think they are going to have some sort of conversation. I'm sure the conversations have already started internally. I'm sure Brady Tkachuk will be named the captain eventually. If it was going to be Thomas Chabot, I mean, why hasn't it happened, by now? And really, that's the only other candidate when you look at this team. So I think it's a matter of time. I don't think they're going to do it. I know there's a lot of people speculating, it would be, the time to do it when Erik Karlsson is back in town on Thursday and Brady Tkachuk's playing his first game and they could maybe introduce him and he comes out with the C on his chest. I don't think they're going to do that. I think they're going to do it the right way, quote unquote, and have a press conference and introduce him as captain and have sort of a collective team meeting. But I think the writing's on the wall. Brady Tkachuk will be the next captain of the Ottawa Senators. I guarantee that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's sort of a foregone conclusion that he'll be the next captain in franchise history. As you said, if it was going to be Chabot, why were we waiting up until now to make that announcement? But one of the little, I guess you'd call it conspiracy theories online that I saw that actually kind of made a little bit of sense is if they don't name him captain right away, the next logical time is in a couple of weeks. Calgary comes to town. The whole family will be here. That could be a potential night. Do you put any stock in that? Or do you think they've got an internal timeline already of we're going to let the first little half of the season play out and, take our time with this?
I like that idea. I'm not going to lie to you. I think it would be kind of a cool thing if his whole family's in town and they could make it sort of a Cachuck event, if you will. But yeah, honestly, when Pierre Dorion spoke to the media about it, he sort of gave like a 1 month time frame, if I'm remembering correctly. And I genuinely think they are going to sort of go back to the drawing board, have meetings, have conversations with who needs to be involved in those conversations, and then ultimately come back and name Brady Tkachuk captain maybe a month or so into the season.
No. Well, switching gears to the Senators' current production, outside of Chris Tierney's 82-goal pace that he is currently on, because I think he would probably be the obvious choice through the first 3 games of the year, who are some of the Senators that have impressed you most this season, just in terms of how they've improved from last year?
Yeah, I look at a player like Tim Stützle, and I know he's not exactly finishing early on in the season, but man, just the sheer volume of chances that he's got in the last 3 games that we've seen, and not just the volume, but the quality of chances. I mean, we're talking about partial breakaways and one-time chances really close into the net. But a lot of it is him doing it himself. So he's not relying on sort of anyone else to create those chances. The other thing I noticed with Stützle is last year he was on the ice a whole lot. I mean, anytime he was engaged in a puck battle, he was probably losing his footing and he was going to be down on the ice, on his belly, on his backside. I'm not noticing that so much now. I think he's gained a lot of strength in the off season. So that's something to keep an eye on going forward, because that is a player that I think everyone is focused on going forward. Let's be honest. I mean, he's the player that ultimately will put fans in the stands when it gets to that point. But there's a lot of players I've been impressed with just in this first little 3-game set that we've seen. Chris Tierney, as you noted, I mean, I just find him way faster than he was last season. He couldn't keep pace. And, rumor has it that maybe he was dealing with some sort of back issue last season. Nick Paul's always looking good to me. He looks extremely good this season. He's another player who can play sort of down in your lineup, up in your lineup, wherever you want to put him. He can play on the power play. He can play on the PK. So he's a guy that always impresses me. But quietly, I think Nick Holden has really impressed me, because you look at the Sens decor and there's a lot of problems. Let's be honest about that. There's, a lot of players that are sort of fringe NHL players, and perhaps players that should be like 7th defenseman, maybe even in the AHL at this point. But Nick Holden comes in, he's traded for Dadonov, and really it looked like more of just a money offload situation. But I think he's really came in and impressed head coach DJ Smith. I think he's impressed Pierre Dorion. I firmly believe they're going to look at extending this guy if he continues to play the way that he played. He's a guy with size. He can play physical, but he's also kind of a finesse player as well. So I've just been really impressed by his game early on in the season.
Well, you just hit on it right there. If you were to point out the Achilles heel of the Ottawa Senators. It's obviously the blue line beyond Zub and Shabbat. So you've got a great top pairing there. Beyond that, it gets a little bit iffy. Were you surprised to see Eric Branstrom not draw into the opening night lineup, or at least not break camp with the team?
No. And the reason for that is, the writing was kind of on the wall. I like to say that, I guess, early on here. But, when I looked at the contracts and bringing in a guy like Michael Del Zotto, which was something that really confused the heck out of me in the offseason, but bringing in some one-way contracts, obviously Nick Holden coming as well, there was just too many guys to start the year. And that could only mean one thing. And I know that DJ Smith wasn't entirely comfortable with both Mete and Branstrom, two undersized defensemen in the lineup. In my opinion, is Branstrom an NHL player? Absolutely. And on the Sens team, is he a top 4 NHL defenseman? I think so. I really think he is at least one of the 4 best defensemen on this team if he's called up here soon. And I hope that they do call him up soon. I hope that it's not like an injury or something that has to happen for him to get a call up. But I expect Branstrom to be here, if for nothing else than to increase his trade value, right? Because he has been rumored basically at the tail end of the summer and leading into the regular season as a player that the Senators might be looking to move out for help in the top 6, which to me, I mean, looking at this current roster, they need more help on the back end, but it's an interesting situation. Hopefully Branstrom's here soon. I think he can play in the top 4.
Yeah, well, it's almost a case of history repeating itself here, where we've got shades of last season where some of those veteran signings and bringing in some aging blue liners, we'll say, didn't ultimately pay off very well for the Senators over the full course of the season. And it wasn't until they started letting the kids play towards the back end of the year that you started to really see that team gel and take that next step forward. Which camp do you fall in, though? Because we want to avoid getting this into like a Logan Brown 2.0 situation of, constantly up, down, not really getting a full-time shot. Like, either trade him now when he's got still high value amongst other franchises, or play him, right? Like, where do you fall? Play or trade?
Well, Kyle, it's interesting because in my mind, I'm okay. Like, I'm okay if the Senators want to move on from Eric Branstrom. If ultimately, you look at the big picture and you've got Jake Sanderson coming in, who could very well be one of the best defensemen, if not players, outside the NHL right now. I think that's how high Sanderson's ceiling is. And then you have other players like Lassie Thompson, who seems to have taken a step in the right direction after struggling a little bit early. He came over to North America. I think he translated his game quite well after, I think, losing some confidence at the World Juniors. He's looking like a much more refined defenseman, not just offensively, but defensively as well. And then, of course, Jacob Bernard-Docker, the other University of North Dakota piece that came over alongside Shane Pinto. So the blue line, it has potential to be stacked in the future. And especially on that left side, you've got Shabbat, Sanderson, Branstrom. Where does he fit in? It's a big question mark. And we had Pierre Dorion on our show and we asked him that. I mean, that was one of the questions that I wanted to get to right off the hop. And he went into great detail, kind of describing where he sees Brandstrom's flaws. And it's, the matter of moving him over to the right side, which I think a lot of the fan base really talks about, right? I mean, when you look at the big picture, you're like, okay, well, if we have Shabbat and Zub, Sanderson and Branstrom, that's one hell of a top 4, but can Branstrom play the right side? And I think the player's preference is to play the right side. He's came out and said that before. He's played the right side in the past, but ultimately Pierre Dorion kind of shut it down right away. He said he kind of dead ends himself when he plays his offside. Defensively, it just doesn't work out for them. They're not comfortable, and they're not going to be comfortable until he's like a 5-year NHL veteran to play him on the right side. So I think that really does spell the end of his days in Ottawa, because I don't think you traded for Mark Stone to get a player that's going to play on your bottom pairing and maybe get some second line power play opportunities. So ultimately, Branstrom, I think, will be moved. I don't know if it's going to happen right away. And I think it might be better, as I said, to get him back up here. I do think he could play on this team this is not, I mean, if we face reality, this is not going to be a playoff team this year, I don't think, especially in the Atlantic. So why not increase Eric Branstrom's value, play him in the top four right now, give him a steady partner like a Nick Holden, and let him showcase his talents, because I think offensively he has an awful lot to give. I think outside of Thomas Chabot, he's easily the second best offensive defenseman on the Senators blue line today. And I think that can only increase his value. Right now, you're dealing with a hypothetical player, right? You're potentially dealing a player that has hypothetical value. Is he a top four defenseman? Is he a top six defenseman? Heck, is he even an NHL defenseman? And some teams will be wondering that when they call to acquire Eric Branstrom. So I don't know what you're going to get for him right now. Maybe another player who has a lot of question marks in his game.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned off the top of there too. Obviously, the Sens are making headlines around the hockey world for a variety of reasons. A couple of them are for trade rumors, and Jack Eichel was linked to them for a while. Like we won't go down that rabbit hole because I think he's got a little bit of FOMO going on right now, seeing the hot start that Buffalo is off to without him. But I mean, one of the things that has always been, let's say, a bit of a dark cloud around the Senators franchise is just some of the off ice things. And one of the things that just made headlines, like you mentioned, the less than capacity crowd they had against Dallas Sunday afternoon game. They only drew 8K. I believe it was one of their lowest attendances ever since moving to the CTC. Like, what do you make of that? Is that more a case of this is a true reflection of some of the bridges that need to be mended between management and ownership and the fan group? Or do you think it's just more of a one-time blip? Hey, we're just coming out of a pandemic. How comfortable are people really going to these mass things? Like, do you have any cause for concern, or do you think that management does have some work to do?
Actually, Kyle, again, I'm going to kind of cop out and go in between here, but I think it's a little bit of both. I think you look around the league and attendance is down everywhere. I mean, even the Toronto Maple Leafs aren't selling out. It's obviously it's more prolific when you're talking about 8,000, just over 8,000 people dressed as empty seat night in Ottawa again. But honestly, I would just be patient. Again, the relationship between the fans and the organization, it's always an issue. The location of the arena is another big issue. And I still hear people talking about the traffic and the travel and, just getting to games. And then you've got people with children. You've got the pandemic to worry about. I mean, children under the age of 12 can't be vaccinated. So do you bring them to games? Do you not bring them to games? It's another kind of issue that you have to face as a parent. And then you have the issue of the traffic, right? If you bring them to a game in the middle of the week and you're not getting home till like 11:30 at night, and you've got to send them to school the next day, it's going to impact your next day. It's going to impact their next day. So there's just a lot of issues to worry about. Honest to God, I think the one thing that could solve these issues, some of these issues, is winning. I mean, once the team is a perennial contender, if they get there, if this core group really establishes themselves among the top teams in the league, and I'm not talking this year, but we can look ahead, we can look 2-3 years down the road. If this team is every year, they're guaranteed to be a playoff team. The only if that you have to ask is if they stay healthy, they're in the playoffs. Then I think we'll start to see this background noise stuff. It just kind of goes away a little bit. I mean, it's still going to be there a little bit, but honest to God, I think the noise will go down.
Yeah, no, winning always helps smooth things over, regardless of what sport you're talking about there. And I mean, Ottawa, who has just now locked up Brady Tkachuk to a very rich contract, still actually has the fourth most cap space in all the NHL, even once that contract kicked in there. So this is probably why they're being linked to every trade option and free agent and all of that under the sun right now. So let's just maybe address three of the bigger ones that they've been linked to. We'll put Jack Eichel aside. That one's been beaten to death. But Claude Giroux is a name that has come up recently, obviously an Ottawa area guy himself. Do you see this as a realistic possibility, or is this more so of the stars need to align, Philly needs to bottom out and be eliminated from the playoffs, the Sens need to be somewhat frisky around the trade deadline and maybe potentially be able to get in? Like, is this something you can see happening, or there's a lot of pipe dreams that need to line up in order for this to actually happen?
Yeah. I mean, as much as I'd love to see it, I think the stars really do need to align. If we're talking about Claude Giroux this season, I mean, if you want to go into the offseason, I mean, he's going to be an unrestricted free agent. So if you go into the offseason and maybe he's interested in playing for his hometown and Ottawa is interested in bringing him in to play, if there's still, a glaring sort of need in the top six, then maybe it does work out. But I think at least for this season, the stars do need to align. If Philadelphia is competing, for the Stanley Cup, they're in a playoff position. They're definitely not going to be sellers. So there's no way that they're looking to move on from Claude Giroux in my mind. And they might even try to re-sign him. So there's so many things that would have to happen. And yeah, Ottawa would obviously have to be in the running as well. Close to, and they're going to be adding likely Jake Sanderson, as we talked about earlier. So adding someone like Jake Sanderson and Claude Giroux at the end of the season would be fireworks for Ottawa. And that would probably, fill a little bit more seats at least. But at this stage, it's definitely a pipe dream.
Yeah. Dylan Strome in Chicago, another name that keeps popping up from time to time. Now, they were linked to Strome a little bit last year, kind of died down a little bit now that he's getting healthy scratched in Chicago, and it's clear that he's going to get moved. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. Do you see that as a possible trade target, or do you think Ottawa is more confident in some of their own prospects at that position than they would be at trying to acquire a player like Strome?
Yeah, I do see Strome as a real possibility. I know it's funny, in the offseason, they were linked to both Strome brothers at one point. I know with the New York Rangers potentially looking at acquiring Jack Eichel, then, that left some money that needed to be moved there. So to me, it was a concern on either side. I mean, I don't think Strome is necessarily going to put you over the top. And I don't even think that Strome is a better option today than what you have in Shane Pinto. So if I'm a Sens fan and you're looking at Dylan Strome and you're looking at potentially moving a player with high upside like Erik Branstrom, I'd be really, really cautious of making a deal like that. If in fact it's Branstrom that's used as the trade bait to acquire a player like Strome. He had one season where he was close to a point a game. It was a phenomenal season, but you also have to look at his line mates. Like, he was playing most of that season with Patrick Kane and Alex DeBrincat. So, I mean, those are pretty good players. We just seen Evgeny Dadonov and what he did with Huberdeau and Barkov, right? So I think we can't get fooled by some of that. At least, hopefully, Pierre has learned from some of that.
Yeah, hopefully it's the what is it? Once bitten, twice scared, or something like that. There, he'll learn from some of his past mistakes. But New York Rangers, again, another name here, not named Strome, that is now getting linked to Ottawa a little bit, and possibly even a 1-for-1 sort of swap out of highly coveted prospects within the organization. You got Vitaly Kravtsov. Is that someone you can realistically see the Senators kicking the tires on in a Branstrom for him 1-for-1 deal? Just new settings, hit the reset button on both their careers?
Yeah, Kyle, I think this is kind of that middle ground. This is the sweet spot. If you're really looking at trading Branstrom, you want to get a young player with similar upside. I think that's the route I would take personally if I was in that position. And I seen Tony Ferrari pointed that out on Twitter. And as soon as he said it, I was like, yeah, it really sort of got the wheels spinning a little bit. And Kravtsov is the type of player that I think you could take a home run swing on. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But he's a player with really, really high upside. And if it does work out, maybe you just struck gold.
Yeah. Is there anyone we haven't discussed that you've been hearing rumors about, or through your sources, you've heard that the Senators have kicked the tires on once or twice in the past couple months?
Yeah, I will drop one name specifically. And this comes from talking to Ian Mendes quite a bit, and I'll say his name because I know Ian's mentioned this player quite a bit to me in conversation. So it's Adam Henrique, and I know the Senators could potentially be looking for some veteran help. But again, if Branstrom is the trade bait, you're not going to want to move Erik Branstrom for an Adam Henrique at this stage in his career. And he also comes with a pretty hefty contract. I know that doesn't really matter right now for the Senators cap situation, but down the road it will. So there's definitely some caution flags with that player, but that is a player that I've heard rumored actually dating right back to the summer as well. So I'll just throw that out there, and hopefully it's nothing.
Yeah, we'll throw it out there. Hopefully it doesn't stick. But I mean, one other question mark that the Senators do have to figure out sooner rather than later is what are they doing in nets, right? You had Murray, who was quote unquote less than 100% at the start of the season. So in comes Forsberg. He stands on his head. Gus is down in the AHL because he didn't have to clear waivers. So there's some technicalities there. But if you look at skill wise, it probably would have been Gus in the NHL and, Forsberg in the AHL if they didn't have to go through that process. But how do you see this shaping up as the season progresses? Is this something that they've got internal solutions for, whether it's one of the three we just mentioned or someone else in the Senators pipeline? Or is this something that they're going to go out there and need to take a home run swing on establishing a true number one goaltender if they ever want to be taken as a serious cup contender in the future?
Yeah, definitely. Eventually they're going to have to do that. I mean, they're going to have to look internally. I think Philip Gustafson is the first person that comes to mind because he's every game that he's played in at the NHL level, he's been outstanding. He just has a real calming influence. And I think that calming influence kind of radiates on the team because what I notice is that the team plays way differently in front of Gus than they do in front of maybe someone like Matt Murray right now. And I think with regard to Matt Murray, obviously the contract is there and they're hoping that he can start to take the reins a little bit. But I will say one thing, Kyle, I think the leash is a lot shorter this season on Matt Murray, especially, you see the start of the season and the only reason the Senators won 2 or 3 games is because of the goaltending. I mean, you can look at the way Anton Forsberg came in. I mean, he was lights out in both games, even in the losing effort. 3-1, that could have been a way worse game against the Leafs there. So I think that the leash is really short on Murray. He has to come in and play outstanding. He has to be far better than the, 0.89, whatever it was, save percentage last season. He has to get, I think he has to get over 910. I mean, he has to come in and play like the Matt Murray, maybe not quite like the Stanley Cup winning Matt Murray, but he has to at least come in and play up to snuff because he's got people knocking down the door.
Yeah. And you kind of saw Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, 2 versions of Matt Murray last year, right? You had the Sens getting absolutely caved in with some of their less mobile defensemen at the beginning of the year. And then towards the end, he actually posted some respectable numbers down the stretch, especially that last month of the season. So once we do get in there and he's got a few games under his belt, like, do you see one of those being the true Matt Murray? Is it going to be somewhere in the middle? Like, what do you see at this stage of his career that he can still bring to the table at the NHL level?
I was talking to a goalie scout and someone, because I honestly have no clue when it comes to goaltending. I'll be the first to admit that. But someone said, just pay attention to his glove hand and pay attention to how much the opposition targets his glove hand. And when I started focusing on this, I could see it in the preseason that, every shot that came in, it seemed maybe because I was hyper focused on it, but every shot that came in was focused on that glove hand and they were beating him to the glove hand. So I think he's got a lot of work to do. I really think that teams have really cracked down on him. Sometimes, like you said, sometimes he looks lights out and sometimes he comes in. And when the team sort of plays well around him, they can defend well around him and reduce the second chance opportunities and some of the high danger opportunities. Matt Murray can be a good goaltender. He's an athletic guy. He's a fairly big guy. He's good to the blocker side from what I understand. So I think there's some clinical things that he needs to adjust and work on to get better. But I do think it's probably somewhere in the middle. Like, he's a guy that, yeah, he could give up a weak goal here and there. But at the same time, maybe he'll steal one here and there. So hopefully there's some middle ground and hopefully he can find it. Because I honest to God, I think he has to find it really soon.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, we appreciate the time that you've taken to sit down with us here, Derek. For those that are listening, though, that want to either tune into your podcast or see any of the stuff that you're putting out, where are the best places to find you guys these days?
Yeah, so we're at Future Sickos Podcast. That's the main gig that I have right now with myself and Brennan and Jack and Phil. So you can find us on Twitter at Future Sickos Podcast, YouTube, same thing. And then I do a little bit of writing for 613 Sports as well, mostly pertaining to the Ottawa Senators. So that's where you could find me. You could also find me on Twitter at dlee075.
Beautiful. Well, we appreciate you taking some time, and best of luck. Enjoy the Rangers game when you do come to town in a few days there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kyle. It was a pleasure.